Welcome to the Great Basin Weekly Fuels Briefing for Wednesday, July 22nd. This is Gina Palma. Over the last 7 days, we've had a significant change to conditions across the Great Basin with quite a bit of precipitation associated with monsoon moisture that has pushed north across the Great Basin. You can see many areas have had significant precipitation, and this precipitation has been well above normal for the time of year. However, we have had some drier spots or some areas that have seen only spotty precipitation. You can see that in parts of Utah, Nevada, and up into Idaho. And then the driest spots of the region have really been over parts of the Payette in central Idaho. Looking at our lightning, this is over the last 7 days. We've had quite a bit of lightning across the Great Basin. So again, we continue to see initial attack across the region. However, these thunderstorms have mostly been on the wetter side. Looking at how our drought has changed over the last week. This is the evaporative demand drought index here on the left over the last 2 weeks. And you can see we have actually seen some improving conditions over parts of the Great Basin. Still in areas of Utah, we are still seeing the drought in the categories of the ED1 and ED2, but certainly not the significant conditions we were seeing a few weeks ago. Our current drought monitor, our longer term drought here on the right, really hasn't changed all that significantly because with the deficit that we are in, we will certainly need quite a bit more precipitation than even what we've seen to really make a dent in many of these areas. So we're continuing to see severe to extreme drought over much of the Great Basin and even still that exceptional drought in southwest Idaho and near the Nevada border. Looking at our days since precipitation, here on the left is days since any amount of precipitation, and on the right is days since wetting rains or over 1/10 of an inch. And you can see most sites have seen certainly precipitation in the last 7 days, except for just a couple of sites in southern Nevada that it's been about a month or longer. And even parts of northern Utah, despite the moisture we've seen consistently over the last 7 to 10 days, this has been spotty, especially in the lower elevations. So some valley locations have been missed with really any precipitation at all. And as you go up north into Idaho, these points are certainly fewer. And then looking at wetting rains, there have been quite a few spots in southern and central Nevada and in northern Utah, and even in parts of the southern areas that haven't seen wetting rains with this most recent event. Looking at our 10-hour fuel moistures, we have seen improvements really across the region. Some of the drier spots are still parts of southern Nevada and over into western Idaho. Looking at how our fire danger has changed in the last week, this is ERCs across the region. So last week, we were still seeing widespread areas above the 80th, 90th percentile, and even some 97th percentiles in Utah. And then fast forward to this week, where we continue to see showers and thunderstorms every day in some areas of the Great Basin. You can see we've seen a lot of moderation across Nevada and Utah and the Arizona Strip especially. Even some areas up north, but we are, again, with that spotty nature of the thunderstorms, still seeing areas across the northern half of the Great Basin that are above the 80th percentile with ERCs, and even parts of the south that kind of missed some of that precipitation. We do have a fuel and fire behavior advisory still in effect for the Great Basin and the area shaded in red. However, this will be allowed to expire on Saturday this week, just with the recent moisture, although we still have the potential for fires. That extreme to advanced fire behavior we were seeing prior to this moisture has certainly moderated. Our Great Basin fire activity, we continue to see initial attack in the light range every day with these thunderstorms. We still have a couple of large fires remaining in the region, but for the most part, these fires have remained on the smaller side recently. Great Basin dropped to PL3, and Nick is still at PL5. So taking a closer look at some of our fuel conditions starting up north in Idaho and Wyoming, we have seen a significant drop in ERCs really in most areas. The main exceptions will be parts of central Idaho, especially maybe towards the Payette that didn't see quite as much moisture. However, as you can see from the green forecast line, all of our ERCs will be increasing as we see a return to drier and hotter weather later this week and going into next week. So many areas will return to near the 90th percentile in some of the areas that receive moisture, or above the 90th percentile in some of the drier spots. Looking at some of our fire activity and recent live and dead fuel moisture, fire activity has been moderated somewhat. We haven't seen many large fires in the region, but we still had the Claremont fire in the last week and some larger fires in the Twin Falls area. We are still seeing fuel moistures at record lows for the time of year, and annual grass has been cured with perennial grasses still curing up high. However, we've had several fires in southern Idaho that have grown to over 2,000 acres, including the Ohio fire, which was just over 2,000 acres. We had Cow Canyon at over 4,000 acres, and the Black Ridge fire was the largest at over 15,000 acres. So although some of the control issues haven't been too much of a problem, we are still seeing large fires because of our fuel moistures, the spotty nature of the precipitation, and our grass conditions up in southern Idaho. So you can see in the Boise area, our grass areas are still averaging for fuel loading about 35% higher than the 10-year average, and we're still seeing sagebrush and juniper fuel moistures below normal and dropping, even due to recent samples that we just saw a few days ago. Up in the Payette, Salmon Chalice, Bridger Teton, we have had some showers and thunderstorms that have moderated the fire behavior, especially over in western Wyoming. So fire behavior has decreased with really no large fires in the mountain areas. Now moving down to Nevada, definitely more of a patchwork when it comes to ERC, a lot more moderating of the fire danger over the eastern portion of the state that had more significant thunderstorms, some wetting rains, and that higher humidity for a longer period of time. So again, we have seen all ERCs drop, and we'll even see some continued drops here over the next day or so before we see drier conditions move in. But as you can see, once those drier conditions do move in with hotter temperatures and even breezy winds, ERCs will rise rapidly, and we'll see even some of our wetter areas creep above the 80th percentile in the next 7 days, and then our drier spots will be approaching that 90th percentile. Looking at some of our recent fire activity, these longer periods of higher humidity and scattered wetting rains, again over the eastern half of the region from Ely up towards Elko, have certainly modified fire behavior, so not as many fires that have been an issue. But we have had some larger fires. The Little Cottonwood fire was the most recent larger fire over the eastern side of the state at just over 1,000 acres. However, we continue to see elevated initial attack with the continued lightning, so we will continue to see starts across the region. Over on the western side of the state, especially towards Winnemucca, this has been somewhat of the drier side where precipitation has definitely been more spotty. We're still seeing a well below normal sagebrush fuel moisture and even still near record lows, as you can see from the Panther site here. And then you can see some of those rises in these live fuel moistures in the eastern side of the state that have more moisture. Now moving on to Utah and the Arizona Strip, again, a patchwork of ERC here as well. The highest changes in ERC or the most moderated fire behavior has been over the southern half of the state, again, in areas that have stayed more in that consistent moisture. You can see the ERCs have dropped significantly, but also will be on the rise as we see a return to drier conditions, even over parts of Utah and the Arizona Strip for a period of time. So these ERCs likely will only make it to maybe just above the 80th percentile in some spots and even stay just below that in other parts of southeast Utah. Further north, where the precipitation was more spotty, we are still seeing some of our areas above the 80th percentile. And then as we see that return to drier weather later this week and hotter temperatures, we will see those ERCs even creep up above the 90th percentile. So definitely a tale of two cities when you look at north versus south in Utah for sure. However, looking at our fire behavior, even in the areas that have not seen more significant widespread wetting rains, we are still seeing moderated fire behavior statewide. So a lot of starts with initial attack with the lightning, but really no control issues in Utah. And we've seen quite a bit lower fire behavior on even our largest fires. We have had, however, with the moisture, sometimes too much of a good thing is a negative. We have had a lot of flash flooding, debris flows in the area, especially on our recent fires. Cottonwood being the most significant, where we saw almost every day some flash flooding or debris flows, which has washed out roads in the area and really caused significant damage. So that's been a big concern for some of those areas. However, looking down south, even in these areas that have seen moisture, we have had some recent fuel pictures of the fuels where showing the very top of the larger trees and the edges of the isolated ponderosa patches. This is at the Yellow John sampling site down in Arizona. We're still seeing evidence of dying in some of these plants. So roughly 30% of the tops that are turning. So there are still some significant fuel conditions occurring in these areas. And as we return to drier weather, we'll still have to pay attention to some of these. Looking at our critical fuel status map, how it's changed over the last week, We may have a couple more zones here, the Manti in zone 488 and parts of the Fish Lake that will be being moved to the approaching critical. But you can see how some of the fuels have moderated, especially in the south and parts of Utah. So moving out of that critical stage for receiving red flag warnings to that approaching critical. Um, and again, not as much as we would expect to see with some of this moisture, but since it has been fairly patchy and we are expecting a return to dry, hot, and breezy weather, we still have many areas in the critical. So looking at our precipitation in the coming days. So today we still have widespread showers and thunderstorms except in the far west. But as we get later this week, and especially towards the weekend and the dry air pushes eastward, we will see that moisture decrease and these thunderstorms, even in Utah and the Arizona Strip, become a little bit more spotty. So again, we will start to see some changes in our fuels again going forward later in July and heading into August. That concludes our weekly fuel briefing. Check back next week for the latest updates.